for a reasonably short time, but I feel I've known her for a very long time, in a good way. And Deborah and I met through the work she was doing when she was working at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And during that time, she learned that supply chain management can save lives. And now that she's doing the work she's doing with GE Digital and has discovered this passion and knowledge for the circular economy and all that there is involved in that, she now realizes more firmly that supply chain management can also save the planet. So without any more waffle from me, because it's not me you've come to listen to, I'm going to hand you over to Deborah and listen, learn, and just be enthralled by her, because I know I often am. Over to you,
Jenny. And good morning, good evening. I am on the west coast of the United States. So right here, you can see a little slice of the window, and you can observe as the sun comes up and gets brighter. You can judge on what time of day it is for me. Okay, so just confirming you do see the correct screen of one slide, and if that's not true, Jenny, if you can let me know. Today, I'd like to explore waste and value. And of course, these are two concepts that we spend a lot of time thinking about in supply chain. We look at ways of increasing value and decreasing waste. And this is how we spend the majority of our time. We look across processes, we look at the different work that we do with our partners, and this is essentially what we focus on. I first learned about process improvement during university when I studied supply chain, but I think it was actually elements of my childhood that helped me understand that there can be value in waste. I grew up here. This is a small town in the middle of Washington State, a very rural area. Both my parents grew up on farms, and we had a few little spots to grow food on the property I grew up on. And so we composted. And so from a very early age, I learned about food scraps and what can be composted and what can't be. And it was also my first lesson in circularity. My father was a woodworker and built houses and furniture and boats out of wood. And when I was small, I sometimes got little wood scraps to play with, but more often than not, he found ways to reuse those scraps and build something new. Another lesson in circularity. So in this time we have together this afternoon, thank you for spending your happy hour time with me. Let's explore these concepts of value and waste. Up until this point, as a global economy, we've seen value sort of like this: a consumer, a supplier, a customer, a supplier, a customer, supplier, and so on. It's happened in a line. And along that line, we go and find and eliminate waste. Now, the circular economy says there are more opportunities to make money than what we're doing today. It doesn't have to be a line. It can be circular. It can be loopy. This is my artistic rendition of loops and circles along this space. The circular economy says there is more value to be had. Today we have waste, tomorrow we have value. So what is the circular economy? I'd like to tell you a story about the circular economy. We'll cover 4 topics today. What is the circular economy? The supply chain impacts of the circular economy, the supply chain benefits, and then the most of our time we'll spend on getting started with circular economy and the supply chain. But let's start with what is the circular economy? And this has quite an interesting backstory, but notably we'll start here. About 100 years ago, on Christmas Eve in Geneva, on a side street somewhere here, there was a secret business meeting among business owners. And the purpose of the meeting was quite unique. Their products were innovative and successful, but almost too good. They couldn't sell enough to make money, and they were all starting to go out of business. The product was the light bulb. And what's interesting is this was just on the heels of the Second Industrial Revolution, and lighting was starting to take off, but not fast enough. And the challenge here is that all these different business owners couldn't sell through enough items in order to make enough money. So they agreed to cap the life of a light bulb into about half. And this is important because this is the first known meeting of planned obsolescence, where we're planning for something to be thrown away at a rapid enough pace so that we can make money as a business. This is essentially the definition of a linear economy. How do we design garbage? This came just 2 years after Henry Ford coined the term mass production. And since then, for the last 100, 150 years, we've gotten really good at making items along this linear economy. And it works like this. We take something from the planet, we make something extremely efficiently, and when we're done, we waste it, typically into landfill. And all of this mass production really has done something quite extraordinary. I call it mass ownership. This style of a linear economy has allowed the middle class to grow around the world. And this middle class, of course, can afford to buy items, and this has grown the global economy. But of course, we're also discovering a downside. All these items that we have aren't used. So think about Uber, for example. Instead of selling a car, we can sell transportation. So look at an example from my world, from the industrial space. GE realized that airlines actually don't want to buy and maintain engines. What they want is time in the air, time on wing, it's called. And this is important because machines and assets are smart now. We combine sensors and the Internet of Things together with data science and a bunch of math, and we know more than we ever have before. We know about how humidity and altitude and pressure and smog all impact the life of this engine, and we compare that engine to all the other engines in the world, and we get smarter. And based on that, we can keep this machine going longer, which is a key tenet of circularity. Let's again look at where this concept really started to show up. In the 1970s, a number of manufacturers in the Nordic countries had a similar challenge. They needed to find fresh, affordable water. And as you can see, there's water all around, but it's salt water. And so they banded together. It's still functioning today. This is called the Kallenberg symbiosis. It's an example of industrial symbiosis, which essentially is a co-located version of the concept of the circular economy. So you can see 4 different types of resources here, all flowing among these different manufacturers. As it stands today, collectively, they save about $100 million a year just by swapping out different resources with each other. So we talked about smart assets with that plane engine, but now we can start really thinking about what a smart process would look like, and we'll come back to this later. So in a circular economy, there's 2 types of resources that are exchanged among different stakeholders. Renewable, which go back to the planet. So think composting or heat or water. And then technical materials, which are like plastics or metals, and those don't go back into the earth. And these they can circle, and it looks something like this. This is called the butterfly diagram from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, who's the major player in the circular economy space. And again, on the left, you can see the regenerative side, and we'll talk more and more about this, but imagine any activity that could really regenerate the earth. So for example, starting to see plastic bags of water made from kelp instead of from an oil-based plastic. It doesn't taste like seafood, and it biodegrades. So items such as those would go on this left-hand side. On the blue side, we see technical materials, and the goal here is to keep the smallest circle for as long as possible. You want an item to stay at its highest value for as long as possible. And so you see use and reuse is really the name of the game. And then we can repair it and we can upcycle it. And you'll note recycling is actually the loop of last resort. So it takes so much energy to recycle. And as it stands today, recycling typically reduces the integrity of a material. And so that really is our last resort. A concept that's really important to grasp for circularity is it decouples growth from resources needed. And in supply chain, of course, anything we can do to reduce the variable cost is quite nice, I think. So for example, on the left here, we have a linear economy. This is the cost of commodity goods over time. So you can see all the great work from all the industrial revolutions, bringing that cost of commodity down. And in these last 20 years, gosh, we've almost lost all of that productivity gain from efficiency and lean management and all of the concepts we've been taught, because the truth is we're running out of materials in the planet. It sounds crazy, but we actually are. So there we go, scarcity. On the other hand, we can talk about decoupling economic growth from virgin first-time use straight from the planet material. And what this allows us to do then is to take a resource-constrained environment and allow economic growth to happen. It's really quite exciting because the traditional constraints to economic growth are removed. The last one here, again, to compare to recycling. I might change a couple things on this. In the circular economy, theoretically, we would take away the take. There really is no more taking from the planet in the perfect circular economy, except on the regenerative side. So if we think about technical materials, we move away, like plastics, metals, we move away from consumption, we move into users. So the idea is to use items for as long as possible, highest utilization at their highest value. But again, if we think about the regenerative side, like heat, water, foods, we do take from a regenerative source and we do consume. So those language sounds okay for that. Okay, that was a whirlwind look at what is the circular economy. But now I want to think about a few of the impacts on supply chain and reverse, how supply chain makes sure that the circular economy can happen. And we'll do this through the 3 principles of circularity. These are to design waste out to begin with. Of course, we know how to do this. We're supply chain professionals. And the key point to remember here is that circular economy is not about designing with waste. It's about designing waste out first, and then increasing the value of the materials and resources already at play in the economy, which is the second major principle. So how do we make sure an item is used forever is the goal here. And the last, of course, is to regenerate natural systems. So I'll walk through examples of each of these. The circular economy says organizations that anchor in these principles will reduce waste and be more profitable. All right, so the first one is business is based on designing waste out. And this is really interesting because it aligns well to those traditional lean and kaizen thinking of finding and eliminating waste. These business models that are popping up really focus on reducing water, energy, resources used. So examples might be shifts to modular products that can be repaired more easily. So think about maybe even a cell phone. And these days, back in the day, of course, it was much more difficult to change your cell phone out. But these days you can take one section of the cell phone out, replace it, maybe like a screen, or just replace the screen and you can use that phone for much longer. So changing to a modular product design. Sharing platforms, like I mentioned for Uber, let's say, other sharing platforms are coming up that allows customers to pay for utilization rather than owning the entire asset. New technologies, so 3D printing, for example. This is coming up even in consumer clothing to 3D print a garment and you reduce waste as you go. Also happening, of course, in industry, really challenging how different components can be made to reduce the number of products needed. Last one I'll throw out because it's awfully relevant right now is PPE. So right now, what a terrible but perfect example of a linear economy. Most PPE in the world is created to be used just once and then thrown away. And now we have a massive global PPE shortage. But imagine if we held on to the days when PPE could be washed with soap and reused. That is the type of an idea of designing waste out. So supply chains. Of course, we know supply chain professionals are specifically trained to find and eliminate waste. I think all of us can relate to having a really strong year, finding a lot of waste, doing a lot of process improvement, and here comes leadership saying, cool, do it again. And we have to do it again. So we've got good practice on finding and eliminating waste and designing waste out from the beginning. So the second principle, I brought the airplane engine back, is to keep materials and resources in play. This is really about extending the life of the technical materials and being good stewards of those renewable materials. And so the interesting thing here is that we've detached a lot of materials from the planet already. We've been mining for a long time. A lot of these materials are actually in the landfill right now. And so it's interesting because the material that we need is somewhere floating around. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. Business models based on keeping resources in play. So there's a tremendous number of analytics developed around predictive maintenance on machines like an airplane engine. And I mentioned this earlier. So predictive analytics, optimizing spare parts, resource recovery and transformation. So think about ocean plastics. We've probably all seen an advertisement for either a liquid soap bottle or a pair of leggings that's made from ocean plastic. So that entire industry is starting to pop up. Technologies that allow for value chain and provenance tracking. So has this item in a past life been used in a way that makes it unsafe for human consumption? Where has it been? What has it been used for? So supply chains have an interesting consideration on this. If we're going to run the global economy based on materials that exist today, and I mean like look around wherever you are right now, all of that you see is a material that can be used again. And only everything that we can see, plus landfill, plus ocean plastics, would be considered inputs to production from now on in a circular economy. And if we think about this, everything really becomes inventory. So we need to have a way of tracking that inventory. We need to know where and when, at what quality these materials will be available so that we can reclaim them and put them back into a production process. So the last principle here is regenerating natural systems. And this, of course, means leaving the planet better. This is beyond sustainability. This is regenerative. So this means actually making it better than when we started now. So you hear about reforestation that's happening around the world, not just stopping deforestation, but actual reforestation. So examples of business models here, biomaterials that add value upon composting. Very interesting examples, I'll share one later. Renewable energy sources at scale. So think wind power, although there's a couple of because there's a couple of problems with the metals used inside the turbine, but let's say renewable energy sources. New production of new materials like that seaweed packaging I'd mentioned. Seaweed is extremely strong and a great input to making bioplastics. And reducing the strain on natural land by investigating different sources of proteins. You've probably seen a lot of investment going into lab-grown meats, insect-based protein sources that 50 or 100 years from now may not seem so strange and really reduces the burden on land. So supply chains, what role do we play here? If we think about moving around bioplastic rather than oil-based plastics, and the heat that can often be produced inside of a truck or a warehouse, we'll have to start paying more attention to the temperature and how we're stewards of this material. It also is likely that materials will stay local much longer. So really, if we think about the different principles of the circular economy, it says use something locally, reclaim it locally, transform it locally, and keep resources local for as long as we can so that we're not transporting it long distances. So that'll also have a big impact in the way that we manage the resources around the world. Okay, so we've covered what is a circular economy, some of the impacts and relationships with supply chain. I want to highlight a couple of benefits of the circular economy on supply chain now. So we'll cover 4. The first is a shift from waste streams to value streams. So if we look at this picture, and if I asked you, what do you see? Probably you'd say waste. Some say value. And of course, who defines value but the customer? And the circular economy says there are more customers out there. With your existing model, there are likely more customers to be had. We'll talk a little bit about fugitive value later and how to find those customers. But there are more customers to be had. You can make more money with your current operations. All right, circular economy can be a strategy for supply chain. So we know that we offer a few benefits to the organizations that we support. We can be fast, cheap, or good. And over the years, we're now starting, I think, to kind of run out of options to get faster and cheaper and better. We could probably be better, but fast and cheap. So I'm based in Seattle. I'm literally surrounded by Amazon buildings. We get all of the fast shipping trials. And so I ordered printer ink one day, and lo and behold, it took all of 23 minutes to arrive at my house. It's pretty fast. So what do? We can find an additional strategy. If we consider making an item, but we don't have to start from scratch every time, faster as we produce that item. Similarly, if we don't have to start from scratch every time, we can actually, when we think about built to last, so we can use circular economy as a strategy for our supply chains, even if the organizations we support are not pursuing a circular business model. All right, we have a somewhat busy slide around the cost to create work. Happy to share this after, because I won't go through the entire thing in detail. But the important thing here is there's a great thought leader called Walter Stahel, and he's saying, look, how do we change the way that we define good in an economy? So if we think about cost, so money inputs, material inputs, and labor inputs, and we have our traditional ratios of good. Now, this is for a linear economy with considering virgin materials. He argues, what if we have a new way of defining good? So here we have the same three elements and a comparison of remanufactured, reman, and new. And we can start looking at these ratios in a different way. One of the concerns people have when looking at a circular economy is the time and manual labor input, or just labor input, goes up. If we're refurbishing something, the time spent seems to be disproportionately increased. And it is. However, if we look at the materials needed and the material inputs, they go down significantly. So actually the result of this says it is cheaper to create work in a circular economy. I can't think of a single economy in the world right now that wouldn't want to have a cheaper way to create jobs. And this is really a lovely example. So recommend checking out Walter Stahel and considering that this is a great positive benefit of the circular economy for supply chains. Last benefit. So when we see this picture these days, we think risk, because borders are super risky right now. We don't know when they're going to be open or closed. And I mentioned this a little bit earlier. Circular economy means less disruption because we're producing locally. And so I had mentioned earlier the concept of claiming materials locally, transforming it locally, and using it locally as much as possible. Now, I still think there's going to be a place for global trade. I think it will reduce. It's getting a little bit out of hand with how much we're shipping items all the way around the world for transformation and often back to the home country for consumption. All right, last section, this we'll spend the most time on. How do we get started getting our value streams from waste streams? What does that look like? And of course, it's going to be a circular process. We'll step through each of these and I'll give a couple of examples. So of course, before we get started, we have to even know what the world looks like today. I referred to this earlier. So I like this concept a lot of fugitive value. So we don't have waste anymore. It's value that isn't where we want it to be. It's escaped from the value chain and it's not where it should be. A plastic bottle in the ocean, for example, it's fugitive. It's stopped adding value to our value chains. So this idea of fugitive value, which I think is really clever. Now, if we think about our own operations and we start thinking about the process of even receiving something in to our warehouse that will then transform maybe in a manufacturing process and ship out again. The biggest amount of fugitive value I see in this is packaging. Often supplier packaging is missed as we do value stream mapping. So one way to get started, at least as a baseline, is to weigh everything on the way in and the way out of every business process you have. It sounds crazy, but for the most part, we're weighing everything on the way in anyway, not always with the packaging. What this allows us to do is create a ratio then that says how much in and how much out. Everything should be accounted for somehow. Even if we think about consumables like oil, somewhere, it evaporates, it goes someplace. And this is sort of the new version of doing value stream mapping, is to understand every single pound, kilo, gram of materials that goes in, it has to come out someplace. And then we have a good baseline of where we can even start. So the next step will be what's called to intensify the loop or intensify the circle. What this means is to increase utilization of those materials. And often it means to redesign something. And I put this ahead of just our business models and say, look, an incremental improvement is not what we need right now. We actually need to rethink everything. And there's 3 different things that we can redesign here. We could redesign our business model. We could shift to product as a service instead of selling individual items. That's one big shift we could consider. And of course, that has repercussions for the supply chain. We could redesign the product. There's some concepts called design for recycling or design for sustainability. And the idea that the materials can be easily repaired or upgraded or reintegrated into the supply chain. So less super glue and easier to disassemble. So the product itself can be redone. And then of course that has supply chain repercussions in it as well. Notably, we can also redesign the process. And so this, again, is where we think about 3D printing as an option, where maybe there's an entire step we can completely eliminate from our process. So we really can take a keen eye at how do we intensify material use and ideally drive up utility to 100%. Ideal state, everything is used all the time. Is that reasonable? I'm not sure. But that's really the goal in this step. The next is to do what's called narrowing the circle. This is about using less, so just narrowing the pie of resources used. And again, if we think about the power, heat, energy that goes into our operations, there are mechanisms now that can make us smarter here. The cost of sensors has come down so significantly that it helps us to take what's often a single power bill for an operation and actually break it down by sub operations. So we can actually start to say, okay, where is this actually happening? How much water am I using? How much power am I using? And we can start to be more informed about reducing each of these steps. The next item is around prediction. And this is where we really start to launch into circularity. If we look at the first 3, identify, intensify, narrow, okay, we can say those are kind of traditional supply chain steps. We've been doing this for a long time. Now we're really going to start the foray into newer types of circular concepts. If we think about the fact that we're all sitting in the middle of Industry 4.0, and I think some days painfully reminded through all of our Zoom meetings that we live in a technology-driven world. But the positives here is sophistication of technology is high. The cost of sensors, like I mentioned, has become very low. We have more data than we ever have before, which just allows us to do big data analysis. We have a connected, smart world. And some of this data is about smart process. And I mentioned this earlier, we talked about smart assets, and then we looked at that Kallenberg symbiosis, industrial symbiosis, where they're exchanging different materials. And so we can consider that to be a smart process that learns about itself and can be compared to other processes around the world. If we think about this in the context of circularity and supply chain, if we want to find and circulate materials in a new type of marketplace. So imagine the commodities markets of today are no longer, and now we get our inputs from secondary materials markets, we need to know a lot about the materials around the world. We need to know, again, the quality, the quantity, the timing, the whole process of finding raw good inputs is going to change. Today, that's done through mining, of course. And tomorrow, it's going to be done by what's already been mined and made into some object. And so we want to be able to find that object today. What I think is quite interesting is if I imagine the mining of tomorrow, I think we'll actually mine existing waste fields. So as we know, of course, we're mining the ocean for plastic. We're on a trajectory to have more plastic than fish by weight in the ocean. So there's plenty of plastic there to start with. I do suspect that at some point we'll actually mine landfill. Sounds crazy, but many of the items in there will take several thousand years to break down. And so they'll still be hanging out waiting. So that's my prediction. I think it might take 40 or 50 years, but here we are. All right, so after we've done all of this, we've found fugitive value. We've increased the utilization as much as we can. We've reduced what we need in our operations, and we're starting to get smarter about where resources are going to be in the future in order to match them and pair them and make these marketplaces of the future. And now we really want to make sure that the item that we have made stays as itself for as long as possible. We want to slow the circle, so slow the life cycle as it goes around. And I'll come back to the airplane example here because I think it's quite interesting. In a circular economy, this airplane engine would last forever, is really the concept. Of course, there will be maintenance, but the concept is, how do we keep this metal working as long as we can? How do we change out just the components and really bring back a repair society? There's some interesting legislation being passed in European countries around right to repair. And it's interesting, as I give these presentations, one woman had told me as a child, you know, they got their washing machine in their house and it came with a repair pamphlet and commonly needed spare parts so that everybody could repair their own items. And of course, today's world, a washer lasts 10 or 15 years. It's never intended to be washed. We're really rooted in this planned obsolescence, linear economy. But we're starting to see, you know, repair cafes pop up. One of the positive things about everybody being home all the time is that I think repair is coming back. What else do we have to do? Now I'm talking back in March, April, May. We're also busy now, but we could repair and spend a lot of time focusing on repairing instead of buying new. Okay, second to last here is closing the loop. This is really where we have an item, it's become fugitive, but it's okay because we found it and we're closing the loop. And some examples here are a material that no longer has value in its current form. So here's a good example of fugitive value, plastic bottles that have gone out into the world. This is actually in Haiti. And we give it new value. So this is plastics that have been reclaimed and chipped. And this actually goes into ink cartridges for HP. But the example I'm giving, of course, is a shoe from Adidas made from ocean plastics. And so here's a good example of taking a fugitive value and turning it into a higher value. This goes beyond upcycling, really. This is a totally new process called the circular economy. To take an item and transform it into something new, giving this plastic a second life. And if I recall, if I remind us all of the butterfly diagram, that's on the blue half, the technical half of finding plastics, transforming it into something new and making a new item. Let's give an example of the green side, the regenerative side. So this is kind of a fun example. If we take something like mushrooms, they grow rather quickly, and we have them grow inside of agriculture byproduct. So imagine the stalk of corn after the little ear has been taken and we have this whole stalk. We could chip that, put it in a mold, start mushroom spores, and after 7 to 9 days, we have something that looks like this. And this has become a styrofoam compete in both functionality and cost. And it's quite an interesting example of this regenerative side, because we've taken something that grows quickly, so it counts as regenerative. We use what's already been waste as the feedstock, as the base of this agriculture byproduct. And in just 7 days, we have this item. And the cool thing is that in about 3 months, this will compost. And so it'll go back to the planet, and it can start this regenerative loop all over again. So a couple of examples of closed loop products that are really happening today. Now, I add another item. As you're reading about circularity, there isn't a lot focused on capture. And I don't know if they intend for it to be someplace else, but being in supply chain, I think we know the importance of supply. And so I've called this out as a completely separate item, and I've put it after closing the loop, because I think we need to spend time focused the whole rest of this process on what's coming into our supply chains. I find most of what's out there on circularity focuses so much on the end of life and making sure my product doesn't end up in landfill, but we really need to, which we all know, we need to realize we're all a network and supply chains feed each other. And so here I am talking about capturing, and I'll give another call out here to plastics in the ocean. I think this secondary resources as a service is going to emerge as quite a strong and competitive space. We're starting to see this happening already. If we think about somebody like a Unilever, a Procter & Gamble, or a Henkel who is using ocean plastics, it's not like they're going into the ocean. One really interesting company doing this is called the Plastic Bank. Recommend looking them up. And they've got the hypothesis that what if we treated plastic like cash? It has value, it's fugitive value, but what if we assign it real value? And so what they're doing is creating local economies around plastic collection that's then transformed and sold into value chains. And a big partnership was just launched actually between the Plastic Bank and Henkel Home Goods. So really interesting work here, and this idea of capturing value, and this could extend into understanding and landscaping where materials are in the world. I think sometimes we don't really even know what comes off of our own value chains, off our own production floor. We have scraps that come off and probably we throw them away. Maybe we try to harvest some of the metals, but often it's not cost competitive. But the circular economy says it is and it can be, and you can partner across industries to make economies of scale worth it. All right, so we've managed to go all the way around the loop, and we've covered what is the circular economy, the relationship with supply chain, the benefits to supply chain, and a few ideas on getting started with circularity and supply chain, even if it's just weighing what comes in and weighing what goes out. So huge thanks. I know it's late in the day, so thank you for joining me. You can see the sun has now come up here. So thank you for this, and happy to answer any questions.
Brilliant, thank you. So now we are all experts, hopefully, are we? Already? Well, we're at least starting to be. Has anyone got questions for Deborah? She keeps saying how late it is in the day, but you know, A, we don't have wine, and B, it's still only 3:45, so we've still got a lot of time left in the office. So it's not bad at all. We've got time for questions. You can either put your hand up, unmute yourself and ask a question, or if you're shy, you can do it in chat. Deborah has got access to the chat, or I can interpret if necessary. Michael, if you had a question, I could always interpret from the Irish to English if you needed it.
I actually have a question. Deborah, I heard some of the names that you were mentioning when you were talking about some of the, I want to say, earlier thought leaders or something. If we wanted to read up a little bit more about this, whose work could we look into?
Yes, so I'll put 2 names in the chat. Walter Stahow has been researching this space since the 60s. And he's actually rather active on LinkedIn. I had such a celebrity moment when I tagged him in a post and he wrote me back. I was like, Walter, stay on. So he is just brilliant. He's written 2 books that I highly recommend. They're actually pretty good reads. Type of material, so highly recommend. Ellen MacArthur Foundation, I didn't talk about Ellen MacArthur at all. She really kind of founded this circularity movement about 10 years ago. She's a solo sailor and has actually holds the record, I think still, for number of solo sails, pace of solo sails, and she would go around the world by herself. And she started a foundation about 10 years ago. So they're really the big change makers. This year, their big focus areas are on food and cities. In the next 20 years, 80% of the world is going to live in cities. So if we can crack the city net, we're going to do pretty well. They have heavily invested in their education areas. They work with IDEO, and their learning hub on circularity is really cool. It's a very pleasant scrolling experience and videos, and it's a really good experience. So highly recommend Ellen MacArthur's website. And also, since we're all stuck inside anyway, grab a couple of books from Walter. Really recommend those reads.
Okay, great, thanks.
Thanks, Elnay.
I've got a question as well. Hi, Deborah. So you actually mentioned some really interesting things there. I like what you said about the metrics piece and measuring the waste that's coming in by weight and things like that. That was great and really useful. Another piece that I think, from a pitfall point of view, and it's something that I've been thinking about a lot, is the demand management piece of circular economy.
Right.
You know, and we can almost hardly get it right in terms of when we make something from scratch, get the demand and forecasting right. Now we have to, know what's the waste of something else from an independent process to actually use that as an input into a separate process. But what is, in your experience, been some of the biggest pitfalls to actually implementing the circular economy concept?
Really good question. A lot to unpack there. I'll answer your actual question first with a piece of evidence. So about 5-6 years ago, the US Chamber of Commerce commissioned a study to say, where can we start a Kallenberg symbiosis? Where can we have industrial symbiosis? And they looked at almost 400 manufacturing sites along the East Coast, and they found 200 different materials used, shared by more than one, in 12 that would be very strong candidates for sharing. So the material availability and the cost was actually not the prohibitive factor. The constraint was finding a leader, finding somebody who's willing to step up and take that community space. And to knock on my country, but we're not really known for community-based sharing, all in it together type of a mentality, which is, I think, why we see this industrial symbiosis a little bit stronger in the Nordic countries, where that sharing community, these are all our resources mentality is more prolific. So I think the biggest pitfall is getting a clear, clean vision and rallying people behind it. So same as traditional leadership, the materials are there, the financials work out. Some of the largest investors in this space are actually banks. So the banks and investors are seeing that this is the future. And if we don't go this way, we're going to be in a world of hurt. So that's the biggest pitfall, which is somewhat unexciting, but really it comes back to people in leadership, which shouldn't be so surprising. A note on demand, 2 thoughts on this. One, I actually think predicting what's coming out of a planned production line is easier than trying to plan around fickle human consumption. So I actually think if we get to a comfort level of sharing, it'd be a lot easier to know, hey, production schedule of this factory actually shifted, this other material will become available, and I believe our sourcing managers will be bidding on that material rather than commodities. I do also want to call out that some proponents of circularity see a dramatic shift to the way that consumers act. I find that tends to be a developed country perspective. I just spent the last 4 years, well, a couple years ago, spending the majority of my time on the African continent, split mostly between Nigeria and Ethiopia. And I find to deny a growing middle class the ability to experience life in a way that they've been working for several generations to reach is not right. So we talk about a just transition to a circular economy, which means we need to take in the majority of the world who's actually living, let's say, less than $25 a day. So lots of different comments there, but I think the idea of how do we design a system that can work and doesn't rely on the economic viability of buying a more expensive item because it'll last longer, when in reality, we know that the majority of the world can't live like that. So lots of different thoughts, but hopefully that answers your question. Okay, I got a question sent privately, so I'm going to read it. Ask if this concept of circular economy requires some changes in attitude of the behavior of consumers. Ha, perfect. I actually just answered your question without trying. Yes and no. Here, I mean, I guess I'll say it another way. I don't know for fact, but I'm assuming the majority of the world don't go out for drinks after work with their friends and talk about the linear economy. Similarly, I don't suspect that 8 billion people will be read up on circular economy. I think they'll continue to live their lives, and our jobs as architects and designers of the way that society functions means that we need to design a system that works, period, full stop. And there needs to be one option, and it needs to be the circular option, and we've got a ton of work to do. So even if we were to rely on today's recycling centers, we don't even have the capacity to handle today's level of recycling, which isn't terribly strong. So we have a lot of infrastructure to put in place to make sure that this can just work.
Anyone else? Lorraine, I'm sure you've got something to weigh in on this. You've been shouting this shout for over 50 years, I reckon, and talking about it. How does it feel to have a webinar that you haven't had to organize in South Africa, where people are actually talking about something you're passionate about, but in a concept that's business? It's not, you know, I'm not saying that your concept isn't business, but it was all circulated. It started around the hospitality industry. That's where your experience was. But like you say, you were in California when it was trendy. Now it's trendy, but it's not business almost. So what's your take on all of this? And for those of you who don't know, for those of you who don't know, Lorraine Jenks is one of the most extraordinary people in the whole of the world. She has the energy of a 20-year-old and the vision of, I don't know, I think Prof. Lumumba would say the eye of an eagle. It's her passion for the environment and for circular economy, before it was called circular economy, is extraordinary. So take it away, Lorraine. This is like my dream come true, Deborah and Lorraine in one room.
I haven't got enough light on my face for you to see me blush, so I'm leaving your walk. Yeah, my focus is very different because it started differently. It started with, I was a procurement and contracts manager for a very big hotel chain. And I had studied with the Environmental Protection Agency in 1969-70, when they were brand new. So wow. I came home with all this hippie stuff, you know. I was a real hippie in LA and San Diego, trying to turn this whole hotel chain green, and they had no idea what I was talking about. So I became an expert in green procurement. So that is my niche. Circular economy is far more for the big economy, and although, you know, it's shifting there. I've just spoken for Chanel, and I've spoken for a big mining company. So my little green procurements moved into the big companies at last. So yeah, it's just, I think the circular economy is a bit beyond a lot of the people I have to deal with in South Africa. So you must imagine me standing in front of 1,000 buyers from the municipalities in the Western Cape. A lot of them didn't do geography, so I'm trying to explain climate change to them. you've got it. I have to speak a totally different language to you, Deborah, and I admire you. I mean, your vocabulary is absolutely fabulous, on the nail for the people who are watching you here now. I have one concern, which I'm going to be totally honest about, because I'm 77. I can say what I like. I'm the oldest person here. You have to show respect. It's too much focus on solving the plastic problem. We've got to, the plastic must go. The plastic must go. This business of mining it out of the ocean is absolute bullshit, really, because it's just going to get worse. It never goes away. Adidas makes a pair of plastic shoes. They cannot tell me how you dispose of those plastic shoes. I've asked them over and over again. So what we have to do now is find, if they can send someone to the moon, they can design a new plastic. And hemp is a way to go. But you know, we're capable of much more. But I love what you said. I've made billion notes here. Did we record this, Jenny?
We did.
Oh, great, yeah, because it really has been wonderful, Debbie. Congratulations. And you're a jolly good speaker. You kept us listening to every word. Well done.
Thank you. Thank you.
Brilliant.
I totally agree, by the way, on the oil-based plastics. The challenge, of course, comes that it's already made and it doesn't go anywhere. So it's tough to do something else with it. So we've got sort of this balance of how do we clean up the mess while also investing in bioplastics. And I think to some extent, the role of plastic in I'll cap it and say in the medical industry is truly a lifesaver. Outside of that, I don't see a lot of reason to keep plastics, but we certainly can do it from bio-based materials, not oil-based materials. We do have such a challenge though, and we've got to clean it up somehow. Ideal state, we've got incentives beyond consumers and fashion to put that into. But right now, if somebody will pay $150 for a pair of leggings to fuel that cleanup effort, I suppose it's fine, but I agree with you. It can't only be plastic. It has to be, how do we actually make all of the materials function and ideally get as much over on that regenerative side of the butterfly diagram as we can. And I'm so glad to meet you. Jenny connected us on LinkedIn and I've been a fan, and I haven't, well, met you in person, and this is close as we're going to get for a couple of years, I think.
We'll meet one day. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you, ladies. Anything else from anybody? I think we're doing really well on our timekeeping, and knowing Deborah, she's probably leaping somewhere else. There's another thing from Marina here. My neighbor who's plus says that biodegradable plastics were invented like 40 years ago. It's not being widely used. Then why biodegradable plastics? There must be a reason. Is there such a thing as a biodegradable plastic?
This is not research based, so please don't hold me to this. Lobby and special interest groups are very, very strong. And I think the world around oil is incredibly fascinating and very, very strong. I think it's possible to get bioplastics down to a cost competitive state. We've seen this happen time and time again. So before I stick my foot in it, it's a complex world of politics, and we'll get there. We'll get there. We'll see a shift coming. But you know, the electric battery, I mean, Tesla lived a few generations ago and he invented all of this stuff already. And we could have been living in a different way now. But again, our global economy is rooted in a linear economy. We have to throw it away in order to buy a new one. That's how we've designed this whole thing. It's not to hold on to something forever. We don't want it to regenerate because that doesn't fuel as much consumption. And I know it sounds like a big bad conspiracy, but we really are anchored in planned obsolescence. And if you look around right now and do a little bit of a self-challenge, not by your fault, that's the economy and that's how it's set up now. It's actually extraordinarily difficult to not buy into the linear economy, and that we've got to switch those two.
Yeah, very, very good point. It's a bit like the diet industry and putting masses of sugar in our food, isn't it? It's
but it's fat free. It's fine.
Yeah, exactly. That's brilliant. Anybody else? Deborah, what was your statistic? What was that number that you quoted about the amount of energy that's being used at the moment to keep our servers going to deliver email? I can't remember the specifics
I'll
of it,
have
and I
to
don't
look it up.
expect you to.
It's a wild number. The cloud is a physical place. I have a whole podcast about digital waste and how you can help reduce your digital footprint. It's pretty gobsmacking when we think about how many servers are around the world.
Yeah, it's the servers around the world, and it's the amount of unread email. 80% of
85%,
email,
yeah. Never get
is
opened.
unread.
Never gets opened.
Yeah, it's probably all the ones we send all of you, but at least you read the one about this event, so thank you very much for that. Oh golly, we've got flocks of hadadas flying over. You can hear them. So if anyone doesn't have it, if there are no more questions or nothing else that you want to ask Deborah, then we'll wrap up. But say a very jolly big thank you. It's now 7:05 in the morning where Deborah is. We're not as bad as Kenya, where she did a talk at Strathmore University and got up at 4 in the morning.
I got up
So
at
for
3
me,
for a 3:40 call time.
okay, so for me, you are seeing the personification of professionalism, a little bit of madness, but really thank you so much for being a fan of ours, for supporting what we do, and just for being you and doing what you do.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. What an honor. Thanks for the questions, everybody.
Okay. So everyone, thank you very much indeed. Please keep an eye on what's coming up next week. It's a busy week. In fact, it's a busy month. We're going to try and consolidate our notices, but keep an eye on the website. Now that Claire is gone, we sadly have had to learn how to do it ourselves. So we've been a little bit backwards, but we're learning, and the website is now totally up to date thanks to the efforts of the team. So keep an eye on that, and if you've got any questions, you're always welcome to ask us. But keep safe, and we'll see you hopefully Community Connect. Otherwise, we'll see you next week.